Well, as a young feminist, I fought very hard for the right to be a working mother. And that wasn't easy. And my first career as a teacher disappeared. And that's when I decided, always in the company of women, that we would change the rules, that there would be maternity leave. And that was a very big thing for teachers to have maternity leave.
I grew up in a single parent household headed by my mum, and I guess in that period of my life I saw how hard she had to work to make ends meet and how disadvantaged women were as workers in the economy.
I started working with WEL initially on a submission to the Henry Review, and it was through that I started making the connections from the kind of theory that I'd been studying to how that could be applied in what was happening now and what the current fights that we had to engage in, and how to make a difference for women my age and how to make a difference in society.
So I was raised by really strong feminist parents, but I think the moment it actually became clear to me that I was an active feminist was when I was on science camp as a 10-year-old, and I learned about maternal mortality. And it really struck me that actually being a woman and having to have kids and carry that burden can be a really terrible thing in our community where there are no supports and where equality hasn't been achieved. So that was the moment I think I turned into an activist feminist.
Because I have a very clear memory at the age of 3 when I started preschool, when I wanted a drum. And they said, no, the boys get the drums and the cymbals and the girls get the tambourines and the triangles. And I looked at the triangles and thought, nah. So it was quite embedded on me at a very early age that somehow or other you missed out on things. So I continued being a feminist from then onward. I don't know what feminists look like. I think we look like everybody else, you know, hopefully.
Government expenditure on children's services is now $5,300 million. In 1972 it was $50 million. And that, of course, is good for kids, but it's also part of women's economic independence. And of course the equal pay decision in 1973 was the most massive breakthrough.
It was applying for jobs and finding I didn't get them. When I dropped out of university, I turned up at the ABC and said I wanted a job, and they said, could I type? And I said no, and they said, we don't take girls unless they can type. And 2 of my friends who just dropped out of university had just got jobs in the mailroom, so I said, well, you know, you've just hired 2 of my university peers in the mailroom. Oh yes, but they're boys. And I said, how do you spell mailroom? And stormed out of the ABC offices. So I was aware from a fairly early age that there were serious differences about the way women were treated, and I didn't like it.
You know, there are just moments in life when you know something's the right idea at the right time. And essentially, we went to our friends and colleagues. I'd been involved in childbirth politics, so I asked people from there because I knew they weren't frightened of challenging the status quo. And at another level, I don't think we had any idea how momentous it was going to be. But anyway, that was really the first meeting and the origins of WEL. So we became the 3 conveners of WEL New South Wales, and off we went, and we were on a roll really within a very short time.
When the women's movement reappeared in the early 70s, I got invited to go to a WEL meeting. I'd been to a couple of women's liberation meetings, but because I was a single parent, because I had a child, and because most of the early women's liberation movement people, certainly around Glebe in those days, were young university students who really didn't actually understand about people having children, that, you know, didn't feel all that comfortable with them. So it was when WEL turned up with a whole lot of people that had children and were interested in some of the issues around childcare, which was one of the interests that I had. I decided to join.
I attended the 1985 World Conference for Women in Nairobi as part of the Australian Government delegation, and that was just wonderful, especially the NGO forum. But it was, you know, Betty Friedan was there talking, and it was just extraordinary. And we had debates with the Vatican about violence against women, and the Russians wouldn't let us use the word global because it meant that they did it too, that there was violence against women in Russia perhaps. So that was quite extraordinary times.
I think publishing the WEL questionnaire was probably the most memorable because it encapsulated, it wasn't just a moment, it was a series of moments. It encapsulated the appalling ignorance and lack of interest of many people who were running for public office in what it meant to be female in Australia. It also enabled us to have a political platform to force governments to take our issues into consideration in the business of legislation. And that was, I think, the singular great achievement of women's electoral lobby. It put women fairly and squarely on the political agenda for both political parties. I, at that stage, was the kind of comms person who coordinated the publication of all of the WEL questionnaire results, and every journalist in Australia was demented to get it. And I did something for which, you know, grown-up men flecked their mouths as they hissed at me and said, how could I possibly think I was just not going to press release the lot and they could cherry pick it? And what I did was I selectively gave it to journalists. And I wanted I wanted coverage in different ways in different media, and therefore we got massive coverage of the results. So people who lived in some electorates, you know, they decided that they'd highlight the people in their electorates. So it gave women on the ground the capacity to see the feedback from the questionnaires they'd been having. For me, that was the really big moment. I think the other big moment, and it's because it's my passion in life, was taking the luxury tax off the oral contraceptive, which Gough Whitlam did in the first 3 months. And for those of you who may not know, the pill was taxed as a cosmetic, and it had a luxury tax on it, and it was very expensive. So it wasn't just that more women could take the pill, although that was heavenly. It was the fact that it was recognised that everyone had the right of access to contraception. I think they were probably the first two big moments for me.
I mean, the T-shirt I've got on, which I deliberately put on today, was actually the T-shirt that was printed by the Women's Liberation Group in Canberra for those of us that I was one of the finalists in the Whitlam Original Women's Advisors Group. There was myself and Sarah Dowse, Nan Summers, Lyndall Ryan, can't remember who all the other ones were, there were about 8 of us. And we went down to Canberra, and what was fascinating is we all got together, we all plotted and planned, all of these people who were quite powerful women in our own rights, and we were interviewed, and there was a very strong feeling, and Liz Reed, of course, who got it. There's a very strong feeling that, you know, whatever we were there for, we were there, and this is 1974, we were there to, in a sense, undermine what was going on and change the system. You know, this has got a Superwoman thing on the T-shirt in the back. There was a really strong sense of the things. I mean, all of us came out of women's activism, but out of various parts of women's activism. Quite a few of us came out of the WEL sort of background, but others came out of it there. And there was a strong sense of social change. But that was the first ever women's advisor anywhere in the USA. Anywhere, we were the first ones to actually pioneer that whole idea of the femocracy.
What we're working towards is removing abortion from the Crimes Acts in New South Wales and in the other states where it's still in the crimes legislation. But as well as this, we want to see improved access and affordability of abortion. We've seen some really great progress on this year, with RU486 becoming available in Australia, which is excellent, but there's still a long way to go. And we have seen improvements in availability of services, but there's still a lot of problems around accessibility and availability for women, particularly in rural and remote areas.
Another challenge that I think that WEL will need to take up over the next 40 years is, and even in the next 5 years, is the perception that, by young women in particular, that we've achieved equality.
Having worked in the community sector for 2 years, I feel that there needs to be a consistent and increased funding for services for women. I work with culturally and linguistically diverse women, and for many of them, these services are vital for them exiting really violent relationships, and I think that the continual funding and support from government is essential.
WEL has a lot of work cut out for it going forward. The whole women's movement does. We know we've still got problems with pay equity. We know there are still huge problems with domestic violence in our community. We know there are still massive cultural barriers to women achieving what it is they want to achieve with their lives. And I think one of the challenges that WEL will come up against is really shifting cultural perceptions. I'm so lucky as a woman growing up in the 21st century that a lot of the legal changes have been made already. Other women have won that fight for me. What I need to do and what WEL needs to do over the next 40 years is to really work on shifting the culture of the Australian community, which is actually responsible for putting up so many of the invisible barriers that face women in our community. So I think that's the work that we're going to have to go forward with.
I'm a feminist, and having an organisation to work within has been very important in my life.
For me, being part of WEL means that I get to make a difference and that I am part of changing the system, because when you talk about change, you also need to be part of that change, and being part of WEL is me doing my bit.
And it was a really great experience for me. It really showed, it put me out of my comfort zone, but it really showed me what I was capable of.
I'm involved in WEL because I want to take responsibility for the future that I want for myself and for my friends and for my family. And I think it's really important that we do take up that fight, that we don't feel like someone else is going to be there to do it for us. It's our responsibility to be a part of it now. But it's also, for me, an incredible opportunity to work with amazing women, old, young, in between, who just have so much to teach. And I have learnt a phenomenal amount from working with WEL over the past few years. It's been an incredible privilege.
Well, actually, I don't think that's for me to say, because I've been part of the last 40 years, and WEL is most wonderfully in the process of regeneration. And I really think the next generation of women will define the shape and the work of WEL.
There's a lot of perception out there that we've already achieved all the change necessary, and I think a lot of young women don't realise that it isn't until they reach a certain level that they see all these restrictions in place. And I think for the next generation to move on and to have a more equitable society, young women need to be part of this new conversation.
I suppose I'd like to see a feminist movement, a young feminist movement coming up saying this is the world we want to live in. And that's what I'm saying, to put the social back on the agenda, put the good society back on the agenda, and make sure the good society is one in which gender does not become a way of allocating tasks, allocating values, allocating money, allocating power. We've still got that. That's one of the real tragedies. We've shifted the formal barriers to women. We've given women the illusion of choice, and at the same time the power distribution has shifted minimally over the past 20 to 30 years. You know, so even though there are women in top positions, they're there because they're not going to threaten the system. So I think we want to threaten the system. I think we want to start saying this is the sort of world that we want to live in, and it's a world where jobs are valued on what they can contribute to society, not on the basis of whether you've got X or Y chromosomes. That skills are valued on the basis of the fact that they are skills, and not on the basis that you can actually blow up more people or use more technology or whatever it is, vis-a-vis being able to be nice to people, which is also a skill.
It's amazing that we're here celebrating the 40th anniversary and the change that WEL's achieved over the years. And I know from the strong and passionate and committed women that I work with in WEL and throughout the feminist movement that we're going to achieve some great change over the next 40 years. I know that we'll be back here in another 40 years celebrating our 80th and looking back on the changes that WEL has affected in society.